All right, so today let's do a deep dive into this whole general American thing. It's something I've been meaning to ask you about because don't you think it's kind of funny how people just assume everyone in America sounds like, I don't know, like a TV newscaster?
It is funny you should mention that.
Really?
Yeah, because it gets right to the heart of what makes general American so interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
By the way, linguists, we just call it GA for short, and it's not really a single accent, like a uniform thing.
Right,
It's
but
more like a spectrum of pronunciation.
a spectrum. Okay, so how do you even define it then?
It's almost easier to define it by what it doesn't have than by what it does.
Okay.
So when someone speaks GA, you don't hear strong regional markers, things that instantly place them in a specific part of the country.
Okay, it's like I don't know, the default setting of American accents, but with a little more nuance.
In a way, yeah. GA is often what people perceive as a neutral American accent, although even that idea of neutrality it's evolved over time.
Interesting. How so?
For example, back in the early 1900s, those mid-Atlantic accents you hear in old movies.
Right.
Yeah, those were considered closer to general American,
Oh, wow.
but not so much these days.
That is interesting. It makes you realize how our perceptions of accents, even within the US, can change so much over time.
Totally.
Something I noticed when I was reading through that research you sent me?
What's that?
It's just so interesting how much debate there is around even calling it like general American, like the name itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it kind of sounds I don't know,
Yeah.
a little judgy, like it's the main accent and everything else is like an offshoot or something.
You're hitting on something really important there. There's definitely a debate amongst linguists about using that term general American.
Yeah,
Some prefer to use the term standard American English.
right, because standard, it's like,
Right.
yeah.
Which, when you think about it, feels a little less hierarchical.
It does. It really does, because it's almost like saying, this is the standard and everything else is. And-
Exactly. Like there's something kind of off about the other ones.
Right.
And one scholar we were talking about earlier, Kretschmar,
Right.
who's written a ton on this whole topic,
Yeah.
he makes a really fascinating argument that what we call GA, he's like, this isn't so much an organic accent, right?
Oh, okay.
Like it's not something that developed naturally in a certain region.
Uh-huh.
He's saying it's more the result of people consciously or subconsciously suppressing their regional dialects
Really?
to try and fit in.
So it's less about a specific place and more about this conscious choice to, like, I don't know, smooth out the edges.
Precisely. Yeah. Like instead of having this really vibrant tapestry of regional sound,
Right.
we end up with, I don't know, what's the audio equivalent of beige?
Right. Audio beige. That's a good one.
Right.
But you gotta admit, it's interesting. There's a real irony there, don't you think?
Totally. Yeah.
Especially, like, we're always talking about how American culture, especially like these days, values individuality and expressing yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And yet, here we are, maybe ironing out some of those regional quirks in how we speak.
100%. It really gets you thinking about like the push and pull between fitting in and standing out and how those forces play out in language, which is really cool.
Totally. Okay, so if GA isn't really rooted in one specific place, then like where on earth did this neutral way of speaking come from? Like, give us the historical background.
Okay, so like so many things in language, it's a winding road.
Okay.
But most linguists would agree that you can trace the roots of GA back to the non-coastal Northeast
Okay.
in the early 20th century.
Okay.
So think Western New England, upstate New York, parts of Pennsylvania,
Uh-huh.
and the Great Lakes region.
Right.
Back then, those areas all had these like relatively stable dialect communities,
Yeah.
right? Not as much mixing and churning of accents, as you might see in more densely populated areas.
Right. That makes sense. But then I noticed in the research that the Great Lakes region, particularly those big cities like around there, they had their own accent shift later on. So they kind of went away from those general American norms.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Ah, you're talking about the northern cities' vowel shift,
Yes.
which is, oh my gosh, that's a really fascinating thing.
Yeah.
That started around the middle of the 20th century.
Wow.
So you hear this most prominently in cities like Chicago and Detroit.
Right.
And basically what happened is the way that they pronounce certain vowels shifted, creating this distinct sound
Okay.
that sets them apart from that earlier, more general American
Wow.
pronunciation.
Huh. It's like accents are always evolving,
Oh.
always in motion.
Always, always.
Makes you think about how much they're going to change even in our lifetime.
You've hit on a really, really key point.
Yeah.
It's easy to think of language as this like fixed thing,
Yeah, totally.
but it's anything but.
So interesting.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Right.
we've established now that General American is less about where you're from and more about like an absence of those strong regional markers.
Right. Right.
And it came from this kind of like mix of influences in the northeastern U.S.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like a linguistic family tree with branches that are constantly growing and changing.
I love that. Yeah, and we even see how those areas that were once considered General American can change
Yeah. Yeah.
and become their own thing.
Totally. But there is this one big question that I have. How did GA, a way of speaking that wasn't even like trying to be different, how did it become so widespread?
You've hit on the million-dollar question.
Really? Yeah.
This is where like the story of General American goes from interesting to like seriously fascinating.
Okay, so we've got this accent, GA. It's not tied to one specific place. It's more about not having those strong regional markers, and yet it's everywhere. So how did it become like the dominant American sound?
Well, linguists point to this like really interesting interplay of factors, and they kind of converge around the early to mid 20th century.
Okay, like what?
So you've got the rise of the suburbs, you've got these changing social classes, a huge boom around the Great Lakes, and then maybe the most interesting part, all these social forces that are kind of bubbling under the surface.
Okay, unpack those a bit for me. Like, how did all of those things actually end up shaping how Americans talk?
Okay, so let's start with suburbanization. As more and more people started moving out to the suburbs, their daily interactions they weren't as diverse, right?
Okay.
They weren't interacting as much with people from different social classes or backgrounds, which meant less diversity in the language they were hearing and using every day.
So that's where class comes into play.
Exactly. So the way these wealthier, more educated Americans in the suburbs spoke, it just became more homogeneous over time.
Right, right. And I'm guessing with things like transportation and communication getting faster and easier, those social and professional circles they were a part of, they weren't just confined to one region anymore, right?
100%.
So their way of speaking, this lack of a strong regional accent, it kind of became a signifier, right? Like a marker of a certain level of success, maybe even worldliness.
Totally. It was like this idea that if you were educated, you didn't have a strong regional accent. Add to that this huge economic boom happening around the Great Lakes after the Civil War. Tons of immigration, tons of industry, tons of new money.
Creating this whole new class of upwardly mobile Americans.
Exactly. And where were a lot of those people coming from? You guessed it. Those areas where this whole general American sound was already taking root.
Fascinating. So they were almost like accidental ambassadors for this way of speaking, spreading it as they moved around and became more successful.
Exactly. And that success kind of solidified this whole link, right? To be American, to be educated, to be successful, you spoke in a way that kind of downplayed your regional differences. And this is where it gets even more interesting, when we start talking about those social forces.
Okay, this is what I've been waiting for. Lay it on me.
Think about what was going on socially in the early 20th century. There was a lot of prejudice, a lot of bias, some of it conscious, some of it not, against certain accents associated with certain groups of people.
Like who?
Well, African Americans in the South, for instance, or recent immigrants in the Northeast.
So are you saying that for some people, shifting toward a more general American accent, it wasn't just about fitting in, it was almost a way to get ahead, maybe even a way to distance themselves from accents that carried a social stigma?
You got it. It was a way to align yourself, linguistically, with what was seen as the dominant culture, largely white, largely Anglo-Saxon, centered in the Midwest and the West. And it reminds us that language, it's never just about the sounds we make. It's intertwined with power, with identity, and unfortunately, sometimes with prejudice, too.
Wow. You really do start to hear the echoes of history in the accents or the lack of accents we hear today. Okay, so we've gone from these regional roots to this idea of social mobility, but how did GA become like the de facto voice of, well, everything? We were talking about those newscasters earlier.
Ah, yes, the power of media.
Yeah.
So as radio networks started to pop up all over the country in the 1930s, they needed some kind of standardized way of speaking, something that would be easily understood and accepted by as many listeners as possible.
Makes sense.
They landed on this rhotic, General American.
Rhotic, meaning what again?
Rhotic, meaning they pronounce the R sound at the end of words, like car or far, which not all American accents do.
Right. Car doesn't sound like ka.
Exactly. And of course, when television came along, it just reinforced all of this. And that's where those accent reduction classes come into play.
Oh, right.
They were all about getting people to sound more like that broadcast standard, more General American.
It's almost like code switching, but for like an entire nation.
In a way. And it even affected famous people. You know, the comedian Stephen Colbert, he's talked about how he consciously tried to downplay his Southern accent early in his career just to avoid being typecast.
Wow. It makes you think about how much our accents, even if we don't realize it, can really influence how people perceive us. Okay, so we've talked about why General American became so prevalent, but for those of us who aren't, linguistics experts, how can we actually hear the difference? What are some of those telltale neutral sounds?
A fantastic question. We could honestly do a whole other deep dive on that alone, but here are a few things that make GA distinct. We already talked about rhoticity, pronouncing that R sound. Another one is something called T-glottalization.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Right. It sounds really technical, but all it means is that the T sound in some words like satin or button, it almost turns into this quick stop in the back of your throat, like a tiny cough.
Okay, I can hear that. What else?
Another big one is something called flapping. That's where T and D sounds, especially in the middle of words, they become really similar. So in GA, metal and metal can sound almost identical.
Oh, interesting. And what about the vowels? Doesn't GA have something unique going on with vowel sounds?
It absolutely does. GA is known for its vowel mergers, which is just a fancy way of saying that certain vowel sounds that other accents keep separate get kind of blended together. A classic example is the words Mary, Mary, and Mary. In GA, they might all sound the same, but someone from, say, the South would probably pronounce them differently.
It's amazing how when you start to really break it all down, you realize how many assumptions we make about language and how we speak. And GA, it's not just this neutral background noise, it's this whole fascinating product of history, of social forces, and even our own perceptions.
Absolutely. And the most interesting thing about GA, it's still evolving. Language never sits still. Who knows what General American or whatever we end up calling it will sound like 100 years from now. Maybe technology will blend everything together even more, or maybe we'll see these entirely new regional accents popping up.
It's a never-ending story. This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the world of General American English, and for all of you listening, I hope this has piqued your curiosity. Remember, language is everywhere, so if you want to explore more, just pay closer attention to how people around you speak. In different regions, from different backgrounds, you might be surprised by what you discover. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.